The story begins in the spring of 1883, on a single night that would come to define an entire era. It was March 26th, and the air in New York City carried that peculiar cold that arrives just when you think winter has finished with you. Along Fifth Avenue, something unprecedented was happening. The carriages lined the street for blocks, each one more elaborate than the last, carrying passengers dressed in costumes that had required months of preparation and small fortunes to create. They were all arriving at the same destination: the newly completed mansion of Alva Vanderbilt. A structure so vast and ornate that it had taken 2 years and over $2 million to construct, stood ablaze with light at 665th Avenue. Inside, Alva Vanderbilt herself waited at the top of the grand staircase, dressed as a Venetian princess in a gown worth more than most American families would earn in their entire lifetimes. The ball she was hosting that night would become legendary, but not merely because of its success. What made it significant was what it represented. This was the moment when the new industrial wealth of America announced that it had arrived, that it was permanent, and that it intended to establish itself as the nation's true aristocracy. Over 1,000 guests passed through those doors that evening. They came dressed as European royalty, as Renaissance nobility, as figures from history and mythology. The costumes were not simply elaborate. They were archaeological recreations requiring imported fabrics, genuine period jewelry, and in some cases consultation with museum curators. One guest appeared as an electric light, her dress embedded with batteries and small bulbs, a costume that cost more than $10,000. Another came dressed as a cat in a gown made entirely of white cattails and diamonds. The absurdity was intentional. This was wealth performing itself, demonstrating that it had moved beyond mere accumulation into the realm of cultural power. Outside, in that March cold, crowds gathered. They came not to protest, but simply to witness. They stood behind police barriers and watched the carriages arrive, watched the elaborately costumed figure step down onto the pavement, watched the light spilling from the mansion's windows. What they were seeing was the crystallization of something that had been building for decades. The United States had always had wealthy people, but this was different. This was the emergence of a new class that did not simply have money, but had remade the entire structure of American economic life in order to generate wealth on a scale the nation had never imagined possible. The men and women entering Alva Vanderbilt's mansion that night were not just rich. They were the people who owned the railroads, the steel mills, the oil refineries, the banks. They controlled the infrastructure of American capitalism itself. They were building monuments to announce that their power would last forever. Alva Vanderbilt understood exactly what she was doing. She was not merely throwing a party. She was staging a social coup. The Vanderbilts had money, enormous money, but that was not enough. Her old New York society, led by Caroline Astor, had kept them at arm's length because the family's fortune was too new, too raw, too obviously earned rather than inherited. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the family patriarch who had died 6 years earlier, had been a steamship. And railroad magnate who started poor and built his empire through ruthless business practices that shocked even his contemporaries. His descendants had money, but not respectability, and in the social hierarchy of Gilded Age New York, that distinction mattered enormously. Alva's ball was designed to change that equation. She spent months planning it, months ensuring that everyone who mattered in New York society understood that if they did not attend, they would be declaring themselves irrelevant. The strategy worked. Even Caroline Astor, the gatekeeper of New York's social elite, had to acknowledge the Vanderbilts' arrival. Her daughter wanted to attend the ball, and Alva made it clear that she could not come unless Mrs. Astor herself first paid a social call on the Vanderbilts, something she had refused to do for years. Mrs. Astor called. The old order bent to the new. The mansion itself was a statement as definitive as the ball it housed. It was a French Renaissance chateau transported to American soil, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had designed the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the base of the Statue of Liberty. The interior featured entire rooms purchased from European palaces and reassembled piece by piece. The ballroom could hold over 1,000 people. The dining room seated 200. There was a gymnasium, a Turkish smoking room, and a hall lined with canstone that replicated medieval French architecture with such precision that European visitors claimed it surpassed the originals. This was not simply a home. It was a declaration that America's new industrial elite intended to rival and eventually surpass the old aristocracies of Europe. They would have the palaces, the art collections, the refined tastes, and the cultural authority. They would create a new nobility based not on inherited titles, but on accumulated capital. And that capital was so vast that they believed it would sustain their families for generations. But there was something they had not accounted for, something that even in 1883 was already beginning to show itself. The same industrial system that had generated their unprecedented wealth was also creating unprecedented instability. The fortunes being celebrated in Alva Vanderbilt's ballroom rested on railroads that required constant expansion, steel production that demanded ever larger markets, oil refineries that depended on controlling entire supply chains. This was not the stable wealth of agricultural land or invested capital earning predictable returns. This was dynamic wealth, wealth that had to grow or collapse, and it rested on a social foundation that was already showing cracks. While Alva Vanderbilt's guests danced in costumes worth thousands of dollars, workers in the factories and mines that generated those fortunes were organizing, striking, and beginning to question whether the system that enriched a few hundred families while leaving millions in poverty could or should continue to exist. The people at that ball could not see what was coming. They believed they were establishing a permanent order, creating an American aristocracy that would last as long as the European nobility they so carefully studied and imitated. They built their palaces from marble and limestone because those materials were eternal. They purchased art and furniture from declining European houses because they saw themselves as the inheritors of that tradition. They established social rituals and hierarchies because they believed their world would need such structures for generations. They were wrong about almost everything, but on that. March night in 1883, with the chandeliers blazing and the champagne flowing and the costumes glittering under the gaslight, they had no way of knowing that the world they were celebrating would barely survive another 50 years. The wealth that built those Fifth Avenue palaces came from a specific transformation in American capitalism. A transformation so complete and so rapid that it represented something genuinely new in human history. Between 1870 and 1900, the United States underwent the fastest industrial expansion any nation had ever experienced. The numbers alone tell a story that is difficult to comprehend. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, America's industrial output was modest, trailing far behind Britain and much of Western Europe. By 1900, the United States was producing more manufactured goods than Britain, France, and Germany combined. Railroad track mileage increased from roughly 35,000 miles in 1865 to over 190,000 miles by 1900. Steel production went from negligible amounts to over 10 million tons annually. Oil production increased from thousands of barrels to millions. But these statistics, as impressive as they are, do not capture what actually happened. What happened was that a small group of men positioned themselves at the critical junctures of this expansion and used that position to accumulate power on a scale that had no precedent in American life. Cornelius Vanderbilt understood something fundamental about the industrial age that many of his contemporaries missed. Transportation was not simply one industry among many. It was the infrastructure upon which all other industries depended. Control the railroads, and you controlled access to markets, access to raw materials, access to the entire geography of American commerce. Vanderbilt spent decades consolidating railroad lines, eliminating competition, and building a transportation empire that stretched from New York to Chicago and beyond. By the time of his death in 1877, he controlled more track and more traffic than any other individual in the world. His fortune was estimated at over $100 million, making him the wealthiest American who had ever lived to that point. But more important than the money was the structural position. The Vanderbilt railroads were not simply a business. They were a necessary component of American economic life, and that gave the family power that went far beyond what mere wealth could purchase. John D. Rockefeller took this logic even further. He recognized that oil was becoming the essential fuel of industrial civilization, and he set about controlling not just oil production, but every stage of the oil business, from extraction to refining to distribution. Standard Oil, the company he built, was not a monopoly in the traditional sense. It was something more comprehensive. By the 1880s, Rockefeller controlled approximately 90% of America's oil refining capacity. He did this through a combination of brilliant business strategy, ruthless competitive practices, and a willingness to operate at scales his competitors could not match. He negotiated secret deals with railroads that gave him shipping rates his competitors could never obtain. He undercut prices in specific markets until rivals went bankrupt, then purchased their refineries at a fraction of their value. He created vertical integration, controlling every stage of production so that Standard Oil's efficiency became insurmountable. The result was that by 1890, if you used kerosene for lighting, if you used oil for lubrication, if you used petroleum products for any purpose, you were almost certainly giving money to John D. Rockefeller. This was not simply being rich. This was controlling a basic commodity that industrial civilization required to function. Andrew Carnegie applied similar principles to steel. He understood that industrial expansion required steel for railroads, for buildings, for machinery, for ships, for everything that defined modern infrastructure. Carnegie's genius was recognizing that whoever could produce steel most efficiently and at the largest scale would dominate the industry completely. He built the most advanced steel mills in the world, invested constantly in new technology, and drove production costs down through economies of scale that smaller producers could never achieve. By the 1890s, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than all of Great Britain. The company employed over 20,000 workers and generated profits of tens of millions of dollars annually. When Carnegie sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million, he became the wealthiest man in the world, and the sale created U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in human history. The concentration of capital involved was staggering, but more significant was what it represented. A single company now controlled over 60% of American steel production, and steel was the material from which the modern world was being built. J.P. Morgan occupied a different position in this new economic order, but one that was arguably even more powerful. Morgan was a banker, and what he understood was that the new industrial economy required enormous amounts of capital to function. Railroads needed millions of dollars to build track. Steel mills required huge investments in equipment and facilities. Oil companies needed capital to expand operations. Morgan positioned himself as the intermediary between European capital, which had money, and American industry, which needed money. But he was not simply a passive facilitator. Morgan exercised control over the companies he financed, placing his representatives on boards of directors, forcing consolidations and mergers, eliminating what he considered wasteful competition. By the early 1900s, Morgan's influence extended across railroads, steel, banking, insurance, and shipping. He sat at the center of interlocking directorates that connected the major corporations of American capitalism into a single network of power. In 1907, when a financial panic threatened to collapse the entire banking system, it was not the government that intervened. It was J.P. Morgan, personally organizing the nation's wealthiest bankers in his private library, deciding which institutions would be saved and which would be allowed to fail. The fact that a private citizen had more power to stabilize the American economy than the United States government was not an aberration. It was the logical result of the concentration of capital that had been building for 3 decades. What these men created was not simply wealth, in the sense that previous generations had understood it. They created structural power over the basic machinery of American economic life. Rockefeller did not just have money, he controlled the oil supply that factories needed to operate. Vanderbilt did not just own railroads, he controlled access to markets that farmers and manufacturers required to sell their goods. Carnegie did not just produce steel, he dominated the material that was essential for industrial construction. Morgan did not just have capital, he controlled access to the financial resources that made expansion possible. This was a new form of economic power, one that emerged specifically from the industrial age, and it allowed these men to live in ways that no Americans had lived before. The fortunes they accumulated were measured not in millions but in hundreds of millions. The economic decisions they made affected not just their own companies but entire industries, entire regions, sometimes the entire national economy. And they believed with a confidence that seems almost incomprehensible now that they had earned this power through their own abilities, that it was the natural and just result of their superior talents, and that it would sustain their families and their class for generations into the future. They built palaces to reflect this belief, purchased art collections to demonstrate their cultural sophistication, established social rituals to formalize their status as America's new aristocracy. But even as they constructed this world, the contradictions within it were becoming impossible to ignore. The same system that generated their unprecedented wealth was also creating levels of inequality, labor, exploitation, and economic instability that threatened the social fabric of the nation. The physical monuments they built were deliberate statements of permanence. These were not homes in any conventional sense. They were palaces, designed by the most accomplished architects in the world, constructed from materials chosen specifically for their durability and grandeur, filled with objects that announced the owner's place in history. The Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, completed in 1895 for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo that required 500 workers and over $7 million to construct. The mansion contained marble imported from Italy and Africa, alabaster from Algeria, rare woods from around the world. The Great Hall rose 45 feet, its ceiling covered in elaborate plasterwork, its walls lined with imported canned stone. The dining room could seat 34 guests beneath gilded ceiling panels, surrounded by rose alabaster columns and crimson damask walls. This was a structure built to last 1,000 years, built to house generations of Vanderbilts who would inherit not just wealth, but a position in American society that the family assumed would remain unchallenged indefinitely. George Washington Vanderbilt took this logic even further when he constructed the Biltmore Estate in the mountains of North Carolina. Completed in 1895, Biltmore was not merely a mansion, but an entire self-contained world. The house itself contained 250 rooms spread across 175,000 square feet of interior space. It had its own bowling alley, its own indoor swimming pool, its own observatory, its own electric elevators and refrigeration systems. The estate encompassed 125,000 acres of land, including working farms, forests, and a planned village for workers. Vanderbilt hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, to landscape the grounds and manage the forestry operations. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, the same man who had designed Alva Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue Chateau. The house took 6 years to build and required hundreds of craftsmen, many brought over from Europe specifically for the project. The result was the largest private residence ever constructed in the United States, a structure so vast that even today, more than a century later, it remains unmatched in scale. Vanderbilt was creating not just a home but a dynasty, a physical structure that would house his descendants and announce their permanence as American aristocracy. Along Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the visual language of permanence became even more concentrated. The Vanderbilts alone constructed multiple mansions along what became known as Millionaires' Row. These were not suburban estates, but urban palaces, built side by side, transforming entire city blocks into private compounds. William Henry Vanderbilt's mansion at 645th Avenue, completed in 1882, occupied an entire city block and cost $3 million to construct. It was actually two connected houses, twins in design, allowing him to live in one while his daughters occupied the other. The interiors were designed by the Herder brothers, the most prestigious decorating firm in America, and filled with art purchased from European collections. The collection was museum quality because it was intended to establish the Vanderbilts as not just wealthy, but cultured, as the inheritors of European artistic tradition. When William Henry Vanderbilt died in 1885, his art collection alone was valued at over $1 million. His total fortune had grown to over $200 million, making him the wealthiest man in the world at that moment. The deliberate reference to European aristocracy was not accidental or superficial. These men and their families were consciously modeling themselves on the landed nobility of England and the royal houses of continental Europe. They hired the same architects who designed museums and government buildings. They purchased furniture and entire rooms from European palaces and had them dismantled, shipped across the Atlantic, and reassembled in their American mansions. Vanderbilt's chateau contained a medieval banquet hall purchased from a French castle. J.P. Morgan's library housed illuminated manuscripts and rare books that had once belonged to European nobility. The message was explicit. America's industrial elite saw themselves not as temporary beneficiaries of economic expansion, but as the founders of a new aristocratic order that would parallel and eventually surpass the old aristocracies they so carefully studied. The architects they employed understood this ambition and designed accordingly. Richard Morris Hunt became the preferred architect of the American elite precisely because he had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and understood European palatial architecture in ways that American-trained architects could not match. Hunt designed not just houses, but historical statements. His buildings for the Vanderbilts referenced specific periods and styles. The breakers evoked Renaissance Italy. Marble House, another Newport mansion he designed for Alva Vanderbilt, was modeled on the Petit Trianon at Versailles in the White House. These were not arbitrary aesthetic choices. They were calculated assertions that America's new wealth deserved the same architectural language that had been reserved for royalty and inherited nobility. The materials alone communicated permanence. Marble, limestone, granite, bronze. These were the materials of monuments, of structures built to survive centuries, and they were chosen specifically to announce that the families who commissioned these palaces expected their descendants to occupy them far into the future. Newport became the most concentrated expression of this worldview. The summer cottages, as they were called with deliberate understatement, lined the coast in a display of competitive grandeur that had no equivalent anywhere else in America. Marble House cost $11 million, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. Rosecliff, designed to entertain 600 guests, was modeled on the Grand Trianon at Versailles. The elms featured classical revival architecture and gardens, designed after the great estates of France. These were not vacation homes. They were seasonal palaces, occupied for perhaps 2 months each summer, maintained year-round by staffs of dozens, built at costs that exceeded the annual budgets of many American towns. The families who built them, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Belmonts, saw Newport as the American equivalent of the aristocratic. Country houses of England, places where the elite could gather away from the public eye, where marriages could be arranged, where the next generation could be socialized into their expected roles as the permanent ruling class of American society. Inside these structures, the daily life reflected assumptions about permanence and hierarchy that seem almost alien now. The mansions required enormous staffs to function. Dozens of servants, sometimes over 100, occupied separate quarters, used separate staircases, followed elaborate protocols about when and how they could appear in the family's presence. The families themselves maintained schedules and rituals borrowed from European aristocratic life. Formal dinners every evening with multiple courses and elaborate table settings. Daily receiving hours when social calls were expected and returned according to strict etiquette. Seasonal migrations between city mansions, country estates, and Newport cottages. This was not simply wealthy people enjoying their money. This was the creation of an entire social system, complete with its own rules, its own institutions, its own assumptions about hierarchy and permanence. The irony, visible only in retrospect, is that most of these structures were built in the final decades before the world that created them began its collapse. The Breakers was completed in 1895. Biltmore in 1895, Marble House in 1892. The great Fifth Avenue mansions rose throughout the 1880s and 1890s. This is the high point of Gilded Age confidence, the moment when the industrial elite believed most firmly in their own permanence. They were building for centuries, establishing family seats that would house generations of descendants, creating physical manifestations of what they assumed was their eternal place in American society. But even as the palaces rose, a counterforce was building in the streets below. The same industrial system that generated unprecedented wealth also created unprecedented human suffering. And that suffering was not an accident or an unfortunate side effect. It was built into the structure itself. The fortunes celebrated in Fifth Avenue ballrooms were extracted directly from the bodies of workers who labored in conditions that were often barely distinguishable from slavery. In the coal mines of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, children as young as 8 years old worked 12-hour days in darkness, separating slate from coal with their bare hands. They were called breaker boys, and they sat hunched over conveyor belts in clouds of coal dust, their fingers bleeding, their lungs filling with particles that would kill many of them before they reached 30. They earned perhaps 60 cents for a 12-hour shift, mine owners, many of whom maintained mansions in Philadelphia and New York, considered this arrangement perfectly reasonable. The children were from poor families. They needed the work. The alternative was starvation. In the steel mills of Pittsburgh, men worked in front of open furnaces where the temperature reached thousands of degrees, handling molten metal with tools that were primitive even by the standards of the era. The work was brutally dangerous. Industrial accidents were so common that they were simply accepted as part of the cost of production. Men lost limbs, suffered burns that covered their bodies, were killed by explosions or by falling into vats of molten steel. Andrew Carnegie's mills had some of the highest accident rates in the industry. But Carnegie himself rarely visited the facilities. He spent most of his time in New York or at his estate in Scotland. The distance between where the wealth was generated and where it was enjoyed was not merely geographical. It was a carefully maintained psychological separation that allowed the industrial elite to avoid confronting the human cost of their fortunes. The textile mills of New England employed primarily women and young girls, who worked 14-hour shifts in buildings where the air was kept humid to prevent thread breakage, where the noise from machinery was so intense that workers often suffered permanent hearing damage, or fingers were routinely mangled in the looms. The women earned perhaps $3 for a 6-day work week. They lived in company-owned boarding houses, bought food from company stores, and found that after paying for rent and necessities, they had almost nothing left. The mill owners, families like the Lowells of Massachusetts, were considered respectable, philanthropic, civic-minded. They endowed libraries and funded universities. The contradiction between the conditions in their factories and their public reputations was something they either did not see or did not consider important, but the workers saw it. They understood perfectly well that the system was designed to extract maximum value from their labor while giving them barely enough to survive. And increasingly, they were organizing to challenge that arrangement. The railroad strikes of 1877 had shown what was possible. Workers across the country had coordinated a work stoppage that paralyzed the nation's transportation network for weeks. The strikes were eventually broken through violence, with federal troops killing dozens of workers, but the message had been sent. Labor had power if it could be organized, and the industrial elite's control was not absolute. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, strikes became increasingly common and increasingly violent. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886 ended with a bomb explosion that killed 7 police officers and led to the execution of 4 labor organizers, but it also demonstrated that workers were willing to risk their lives to challenge the system. Strikes were not simply about wages. They were about dignity, about the right to negotiate the terms of their own labor, about the fundamental question of whether American democracy meant anything if it did not extend into the workplace. The Homestead Strike of 1892 became the defining confrontation of the era. Workers at Andrew Carnegie's steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, were members of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the most powerful unions in the country. When Carnegie's lieutenant Henry Clay Frick moved to break the union by cutting wages and refusing to negotiate, the workers occupied the plant. Frick responded by hiring 300 Pinkerton agents, essentially a private army, to retake the facility by force. On July 6, 1892, the Pinkertons arrived by barge on the Monongahela River. The workers were waiting for them, armed and determined to defend the plant. A gun battle ensued that lasted for hours and left at least 10 people dead, both workers and Pinkertons. The workers won the immediate battle, forcing the Pinkertons to surrender. But Frick then convinced the governor of Pennsylvania to send in the state militia. 8,000 troops occupied Homestead, the strike was broken, and the union was destroyed. The message was clear. The industrial elite had access to state violence when they needed it, and they were willing to use it to maintain control. Carnegie himself was in Scotland when the Homestead strike occurred. He had deliberately left the country to avoid being directly associated with the violence he knew was coming. After Homestead, he would spend years trying to rehabilitate his public image, eventually giving away most of his fortune to libraries and educational institutions. But the contradiction at the heart of his legacy was never resolved. The money he donated had been extracted from workers through a system that denied them basic rights and was willing to kill them when they demanded those rights. His philanthropy was built on brutality, and the workers who survived Homestead never forgot that. The Pullman strike of 1894 demonstrated that the pattern was not limited to steel or coal or any single industry. George Pullman had built an entire town outside Chicago to house the workers who manufactured his railway sleeping cars. The town was a carefully controlled environment where Pullman owned everything: the houses, the stores, the church, the school. He presented it as a model of enlightened capitalism, a place where workers would be happy and productive because they lived in clean, well-maintained housing. But when an economic depression forced Pullman to cut wages by 25% while keeping rents at the same level, the workers went on strike. The strike quickly spread, with railway workers across the country refusing to handle trains that included Pullman cars. Within days, the nation's railroad traffic was paralyzed. President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops claiming the strike interfered with mail delivery. Though the real concern was that it threatened the property and profits of the railroad companies, the troops broke the strike through violence. Dozens of workers were killed. The strike's leader, Eugene V. Debs, was imprisoned. But the strike had revealed something that terrified the industrial elite. Workers could coordinate across distances, could shut down entire industries, could exercise collective power that rivaled the power of capital itself. What the industrial elite fundamentally failed to understand was that their control rested on a social contract that was rapidly disintegrating. They had built an economic system that concentrated wealth upward at an unprecedented rate while pushing workers to the edge of survival. They had used violence, both private and state-sponsored, to suppress attempts at organization and negotiation. They had created living and working conditions that were brutal, degrading, and often deadly. And they had assumed that this arrangement could continue indefinitely because they controlled the machinery of production and had access to state power. But power that depends entirely on force and economic coercion is inherently unstable. It works only as long as those being controlled accept the legitimacy of the system or lack the capacity to resist it. By the 1890s, workers were increasingly rejecting the system's legitimacy, and they were developing the organizational capacity to resist it effectively. The violence of the strikes was not simply about wages or working hours. It was about whether the United States would be a democracy in any meaningful sense, or whether it would be an oligarchy where a small class of industrial owners held absolute economic power and used state violence to maintain it. The workers who died at Homestead and during the Pullman strike were fighting for something that went beyond their immediate economic interests. They were fighting for the principle that in a democracy, working people had rights that even the wealthiest could not simply override. And while they lost most of the immediate battles, they were winning the larger war for public opinion. The first cracks in the foundation appeared not from below, but from within the system itself. The Panic of 1907 was not caused by labor unrest or political agitation. It emerged from the internal contradictions of an economic system that had become dangerously unstable precisely because of the concentration of power that the industrial elite had worked so hard to achieve. In October of that year, a few bad investments by a handful of speculators nearly brought down the entire American financial system. The crisis began when two financiers, F. Augustus Hines and Charles W. Morse, attempted to corner the market on copper stocks. Their scheme failed spectacularly, and when it collapsed, it triggered a run on the banks and trust companies associated with them. Within days, panic spread throughout the financial system. Depositors rushed to withdraw their money. Banks that had been considered solid began to fail. Credit froze. The stock market plummeted. And it became immediately apparent that the United States had no institutional mechanism to respond to a crisis of this magnitude. The federal government had virtually no capacity to intervene. There was no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no regulatory structure capable of stabilizing the financial system. The Treasury Department had limited funds and limited authority. President Theodore Roosevelt was largely powerless to act. What saved the American economy was not government intervention, but the personal action of J.P. Morgan, who at 70 years old took it upon himself to organize a private rescue. Morgan summoned the presidents of the major New York banks to his library at 36th Street and Madison Avenue. He locked the doors and informed them that they would not leave until they had agreed to pool their resources to prevent total collapse. Through a combination of personal loans, coordinated bank actions, and sheer force of will, Morgan stabilized the panic. He personally decided which institutions would be saved and which would be allowed to fail. He arranged for U.S. Steel to purchase a failing competitor, the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and railroad company, convincing Roosevelt to waive antitrust scrutiny in the interest of preventing further panic. By early November, the crisis had been contained, but the implications were impossible to ignore. A private citizen had just exercised more economic power than the government of the United States. Morgan's actions had prevented catastrophe, but they had also revealed a fundamental flaw in the American system. The concentration of capital had reached a point where the stability of the entire national economy depended on the decisions of a few individuals. This was not democratic governance. This was oligarchy, and it was oligarchy that had emerged not through political conquest but through the internal logic of unregulated industrial capitalism. The panic of 1907 made visible what many had suspected but could not prove. The system was not stable, was not self-regulating. The people who controlled it had accumulated so much power that they effectively operated outside of democratic accountability. The crisis energized the progressive movement in ways that years of labor strikes had not accomplished. The progressives were not radicals or socialists. Many of them came from the same elite backgrounds as the men they were critiquing. Theodore Roosevelt himself was from an old New York family, related by blood or marriage to many of the people whose power he was trying to limit. But the progressives understood that the concentration of economic power had reached a point where it threatened the entire political system. If a handful of men could control the banking system, the railroads, the steel industry, the oil supply, then democratic governance became essentially meaningless. Elections might change which party controlled Congress or the presidency, but the real power, the power to shape economic life for millions of people, remained in private hands and was exercised without any democratic input or oversight. The trust-busting campaigns that Roosevelt had begun earlier in his presidency gained new urgency after 1907. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 had existed for years, but had rarely been enforced with any seriousness. Roosevelt changed that, bringing cases against Northern Securities, Standard Oil, and American Tobacco. These were not marginal companies. They were the core institutions of American industrial capitalism, and challenging them meant challenging the men who had built the Gilded Age itself. The Supreme Court's decision in 1911 to break up Standard Oil into 34 separate companies was a direct acknowledgement that Rockefeller's monopoly had become incompatible with democratic capitalism. The breakup did not impoverish Rockefeller. In fact, the individual companies were often worth more separately than they had been together, and Rockefeller's personal fortune actually increased. But the symbolic message was clear. No individual could be allowed to control an entire sector of the economy, regardless of how efficiently they managed it or how wealthy it made them. The regulatory agencies that emerged during this period represented a similar recognition that the market could not regulate itself. The Interstate Commerce Commission gained real enforcement power. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 imposed government oversight on industries that had operated without any external checks. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created a central banking system specifically to prevent another panic like 1907, ensuring that future financial crises would be managed by public institutions rather than by J.P. Morgan or whoever might succeed him. These reforms were not revolutionary. They were emergency measures designed to save capitalism from the capitalists, to prevent the system from collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. What made these reforms possible was a shift in elite opinion itself. Some members of the wealthy class recognized that the alternative to reform was revolution. They had watched the labor violence of the 1890s. They had seen the rise of socialist movements in Europe. They understood that pushing workers to the edge of survival while displaying unprecedented wealth created conditions for genuine upheaval. Roosevelt articulated this fear explicitly when he argued that moderate reform was necessary to prevent radical change. His trust-busting was not an attack on capitalism, but an attempt to preserve it by making it compatible with democratic governance and basic social stability. He believed that the men of his class who refused to accept any limits on their power were fools who would eventually provoke exactly the kind of revolutionary movement they most feared. The Income Tax Amendment, ratified in 1913, presented perhaps the most direct acknowledgement that the concentration of wealth had become socially unsustainable. The Constitution had originally prohibited direct federal taxation of income, which meant the government had no mechanism to redistribute wealth or to fund itself through progressive taxation. The 16th Amendment changed that, allowing Congress to tax income at whatever rates it deemed appropriate. The initial rates were modest, but the principle was revolutionary. For the first time, the federal government had the constitutional authority to directly address economic inequality through the tax system. The wealthy elite, who had spent decades building their fortunes, suddenly faced the prospect of having those fortunes subject to government taxation in ways that had previously been impossible. The irony was that many of these reforms were implemented by men who came from the same class they were regulating. Roosevelt was elite. William Howard Taft was elite. Woodrow Wilson, though not wealthy himself, moved in elite circles and understood their world intimately. These were not radicals imposing external constraints on capitalism. These were members of the establishment who recognized that the system needed to change or it would be destroyed. They understood that the Gilded Age model of unregulated industrial capitalism, massive wealth concentration, of violent labor suppression, could not continue indefinitely. The social fabric was tearing, and the question was whether it would be repaired through reform or replaced through revolution. But even as these reforms were being implemented, even as the progressive era marked a clear acknowledgement that limits were necessary, the fundamental structure remained largely intact. The great fortunes still existed. The industrial dynasties still controlled enormous sectors of the economy. The Fifth Avenue palaces still stood, and their owners still believed that their world would endure. Then came the First World War, and with it, the true beginning of the end. The war that began in Europe in August of 1914 seemed at first like a distant problem, something that would be resolved by the old European powers without American involvement. The industrial elite, many of whom had deep business connections to Europe, watched with concern, but assumed that the existing order would survive. They could not have been more wrong. The First World War did not simply rearrange political boundaries or shift the balance of power between nations. It destroyed the entire social and economic system that the American elite had spent decades trying to emulate. The European aristocracy that had served as their model, that had provided the architectural inspiration for their palaces and the cultural framework for their social rituals, was being systematically annihilated in the trenches of France and Belgium. The Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, royal dynasties that had ruled for centuries, were swept away within a few years. The great estates of the British aristocracy began their long decline as inheritance taxes and war deaths depleted the families that had owned them for generations. The Russian Revolution of 1917 demonstrated with brutal clarity that concentrated wealth was not merely unpopular, but genuinely vulnerable to violent overthrow. The Bolsheviks did not negotiate with the Russian elite or reform the system gradually. They seized property, executed the royal family, and implemented a complete restructuring of society based on the explicit principle that private ownership of productive capital was illegitimate. This was the nightmare scenario that American industrialists had always dismissed as impossible in the United States. And now it had happened in one of the great powers of Europe. When America entered the war in 1917, the home front transformation began immediately and fundamentally altered the social consensus that had allowed extreme inequality to exist without serious political challenge. The war required total mobilization of the economy, and that mobilization gave the federal government powers it had never exercised before. Industries were regulated, production was directed, prices were controlled. The War Industries Board, led by Bernard Baruch, essentially took over coordination of American manufacturing. The government told steel companies what to produce, told railroads where to send freight, told factories what prices they could charge. For the first time, the industrial elite found themselves taking orders rather than giving them. The experience was temporary, lasting only for the duration of the war. But it demonstrated that government could direct the economy when it chose to do so, and that reality would not be forgotten. More fundamentally, the war changed who worked and where they worked and what they expected in return. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in factories and offices, in roles that had been reserved exclusively for men. They proved capable of doing work they had been told they could not do, and having proven it, they were not willing to simply return to their previous subordinate status when the war ended. The women's suffrage movement, which had been building for decades, gained unstoppable momentum from women's wartime contributions. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, represented not just political enfranchisement, but a fundamental challenge to the hierarchical social order that the Gilded Age elite had tried to establish. If women could vote, if they could work in factories, if they could live independently, then the entire structure of Victorian social relations that had underpinned elite culture began to collapse. Labor unions gained unprecedented strength during the war years. The government needed uninterrupted production, and that meant negotiating with workers rather than simply suppressing them with violence. The National War Labor Board mediated disputes and often ruled in favor of workers' demands for better wages and shorter hours. Union membership increased from roughly 2.7 million in 1916 to over 5 million by 1920. Workers who had spent decades being told they had no right to negotiate discovered that when the government needed their labor, suddenly they had considerable leverage. The experience of collective bargaining during wartime created expectations that would persist long after the war ended. Workers had seen that the system could function differently, that their labor had value that could be recognized and compensated, and they would not easily accept a return to pre-war conditions. The war also fundamentally altered the American economy's relationship to the world. The United States had entered the war as a debtor nation, owing money to European banks. It emerged as the world's primary creditor, with European nations owing billions of dollars to American banks. New York replaced London as the center of international finance. American industrial capacity, which had supplied not just American forces but Allied forces throughout the war, now dominated global production in ways that made the pre-war period look modest by comparison. But this new position came with new vulnerabilities. The American economy was now deeply integrated into global markets. It's dependent on international trade, exposed to disruptions anywhere in the world. The isolation that had protected American industry during its early development was gone, and with it went a certain kind of stability that the industrial elite had taken for granted. The cultural consensus that had allowed extreme inequality to exist without serious challenge was fracturing in ways that went beyond economics or politics. The war had sent millions of young American men to Europe, where they experienced different social systems, different class relations, different ways of organizing society. They returned with expanded horizons and diminished deference to traditional authority. The literature that emerged from the war, the poetry and novels and memoirs, was deeply skeptical of the claims that older generations made about honor, duty, and sacrifice. The lost generation, as they came to be called, had seen industrial mechanized warfare destroy human beings on a scale that rendered older moral frameworks inadequate. They were not interested in returning to a society where a small elite lived in palaces while claiming their wealth was earned through superior virtue. The roaring 20s that followed the war seemed at first like a return to the old order, even an intensification of it. The stock market soared to unprecedented heights. Prohibition created new fortunes for those willing to operate outside the law. The parties in Manhattan penthouses and Long Island estates grew more elaborate, more excessive, more self-consciously decadent. The industrial elite tried desperately to recreate the world they had known before 1914. To reassert the social hierarchies that had been disrupted by the war, to continue living as if nothing fundamental had changed. But they were building on a foundation that no longer existed. The European aristocracy they had modeled themselves after was gone. The cultural assumptions about hierarchy and deference that had made their dominance seem natural were eroding. The economic stability that had allowed fortunes to grow steadily for decades was giving way to speculation and instability. The immigration restrictions enacted in the 1920s, limiting the flow of new workers from Southern and Eastern Europe, tightened labor markets in ways that gave workers more leverage. The spread of automobile ownership meant workers were no longer trapped in company towns, no longer completely dependent on employers for housing and access to goods. Radio brought news and culture into homes across the country, creating a shared national consciousness that made regional isolation harder to maintain. The fundamentals of American society were shifting in ways that made the concentrated hereditary wealth of the Gilded Age increasingly anachronistic. The industrial elite could not see it, or perhaps they chose not to see it. They continued building their estates, continued maintaining their social rituals, continued assuming that their wealth and position would pass to their children and grandchildren in perpetuity. They did not understand that the First World War had not simply interrupted their world. It had destroyed the foundations upon which that world rested. No amount of wealth or social positioning could rebuild what had been lost. The final collapse came with a speed that shocked everyone who lived through it. The stock market crash of October 1929 was not simply a financial event, not simply a matter of stock prices falling or investors losing money. It was the visible manifestation of a complete systemic failure. The moment when the contradictions and instabilities that had been building for decades finally overwhelmed the structure itself. On October 24th, Black Thursday, panic selling began as investors realized that stock prices had become completely detached from any underlying economic reality. The speculation of the 1920s had created a bubble of unprecedented size, built on margin buying and the assumption that prices would rise forever. When confidence broke, the collapse was immediate and total. 16 million shares were traded that day. By October 29th, Black Tuesday, the carnage was complete. $30 billion in stock value simply vanished, an amount roughly equivalent to what the United States had spent fighting the entire First World War. But the stock market crash was merely the trigger. What followed was the Great Depression, an economic catastrophe so severe and so prolonged that it fundamentally altered American society in ways that would never be reversed. Banks failed by the thousands, taking the savings of millions of ordinary Americans with them. By 1933, nearly half of American banks had closed their doors permanently. Unemployment reached 25%, meaning 1 in 4 workers had no job and no prospect of finding one. Industrial production collapsed by nearly 50%. Farms foreclosed as agricultural prices fell to levels where crops were not worth harvesting. Breadlines stretched for blocks in cities across the country. Shantytowns, called Hoovervilles, in bitter mockery of President Herbert Hoover, sprang up in vacant lots and public parks, housing families who had lost everything. For the industrial elite, the Depression represented something more devastating than mere financial loss. It represented the complete destruction of the world they had built and the assumptions that had sustained it. Fortunes that had seemed permanent vanished with shocking speed. The Vanderbilt family, which had once been the wealthiest in America, saw its fortune dissipate across failed investments and the inability to maintain the vast estates that previous generations had built. The Fifth Avenue mansions that had cost millions to construct became impossible to maintain. Property taxes alone consumed more money than many families still possessed. Staffs of dozens of servants were dismissed because there was no money to pay them. The social season that had defined elite life for decades simply stopped. There was no money for balls, no money for elaborate dinner parties, no money to maintain the rituals that had announced one's place in society. The physical destruction of the palaces began almost immediately. The mansions along Fifth Avenue were demolished one by one, replaced by apartment buildings and commercial structures. The real estate was too valuable to maintain single-family homes that generated no income. And the families who owned them no longer had the wealth to keep them standing. The A.T. Stewart Mansion, once one of the grandest on Fifth Avenue, was demolished in 1929. The William Henry Vanderbilt Mansion, which had cost $3 million to build and had been considered a permanent monument to the family's position, was torn down in 1927, before the crash, because even then it had become financially unsustainable. The Cornelius Vanderbilt Mansion, which occupied an entire city block, was demolished in 1927. One by one, physical monuments to Gilded Age wealth disappeared, replaced by structures designed for commerce rather than dynastic display. The Newport cottages survived physically, but were transformed into museums, their rooms preserved as historical artifacts rather than lived-in spaces. The families could not afford to maintain them as private residences. Costs of upkeep, the property taxes, the simple expense of heating and staffing structures of that scale had become impossible. The Preservation Society of Newport County took over the Breakers, Marble House, the Elms, and other mansions, opening them to public tours. The people who had once been entertained in those ballrooms now paid admission to walk through them as tourists, viewing a way of life that had ended as completely as if it had existed in ancient Rome rather than a generation earlier. The political transformation was even more complete than the economic collapse. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, inaugurated in March of 1933, came from the same elite background as the men whose world was collapsing. He was a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, educated at Groton and Harvard, connected by blood and marriage to the old aristocratic families of New York. But Roosevelt understood something that most of his class did not. The choice facing America was not between the old system and moderate reform. It was between fundamental restructuring and complete revolution. The concentration of wealth that had defined the Gilded Age was not simply unpopular. It had become incompatible with democratic stability and possibly with the survival of capitalism itself. The New Deal represented an explicit rejection of every principle that had guided Gilded Age economics. Government would not simply regulate industry, it would actively intervene in the economy, creating jobs, setting wages, establishing social insurance programs, redistributing wealth through progressive taxation. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a federal safety net that acknowledged government responsibility for citizens' welfare, something that would have been unthinkable to the industrial elite of the 1890s. The National Labor Relations Act guaranteed workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively, making legal what previous generations had tried to suppress through violence. The Fair Labor Standards Act established minimum wages and maximum hours, placing federal limits on exploitation that Gilded Age employers had considered their natural right. The tax system was transformed in ways that made the accumulation of dynastic wealth virtually impossible. The top marginal income tax rate, which had been 25% in 1930, reached 63% by 1932 and would eventually climb to over 90% during World War II. Estate taxes were increased dramatically, ensuring that fortunes could not be passed intact from generation to generation. The message was explicit. The government would not allow the kind of wealth concentration that had existed during the Gilded Age to re-emerge. Society had decided that extreme inequality was dangerous, that it threatened both democracy and economic stability, and that preventing it was worth sacrificing the theoretical possibility of building another Vanderbilt or Carnegie fortune. The last members of the Gilded Age generation spent their final years watching everything they had believed about American society proven wrong. They had assumed their wealth would last for generations. It lasted barely 50 years. They had assumed their social position was secure. It vanished in less than a decade. They had built palaces from marble and limestone because those materials were eternal. The palaces were demolished within their lifetimes. Now, most painfully perhaps, they had believed that their success proved their superiority, that the system that enriched them was just and natural and would endure because it reflected fundamental truths about human nature and social organization. The Depression and the New Deal demonstrated that their system had been neither just, nor natural, nor sustainable. That it had been a specific historical arrangement that emerged under specific conditions, and that collapsed when those conditions changed. The grandchildren of men who had ruled industrial empires found themselves living in reduced circumstances, occupying apartments rather than mansions, working for salaries rather than collecting dividends from inherited wealth, navigating a social world where the name Vanderbilt or Astor still carried historical resonance, but no longer opened doors or commanded automatic deference. The world had moved on, and it had moved deliberately away from everything their grandparents had tried to build. The Gilded Age had not ended gradually or gracefully. It had been destroyed, quickly and completely, by forces that its architects had dismissed as impossible or irrelevant right up until the moment they swept everything away. The story of the Gilded Age is not simply about excess or inequality. It is about the fundamental instability of concentrated power in a democracy. About what happens when a small group of people accumulate so much wealth and control that they begin to operate outside the constraints that govern everyone else. The men who built the Fifth Avenue palaces were not cartoon villains. They were, by their own lights and the standards of their time, successful businessmen who had identified opportunities and exploited them with remarkable efficiency. Cornelius Vanderbilt transformed American transportation. John D. Rockefeller brought systematic organization to the chaotic oil industry. Andrew Carnegie made steel affordable enough to build modern cities. J.P. Morgan stabilized financial markets when the government could not. These were genuine achievements that contributed to American economic development in ways that can not be dismissed simply because we now find their methods objectionable. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their own success. They believed that their wealth was the natural result of their superior abilities, that it proved something essential about their character and their right to power. What they failed to recognize was that their fortunes emerged from a specific historical moment when industrial capitalism was expanding faster than democratic institutions could regulate it. when the scale of new technologies created opportunities for monopoly that had not existed before, when government lacked both the tools and the political will to impose limits on private accumulation, their wealth was not proof of virtue. It was proof that they had positioned themselves strategically during a brief window when the rules of democratic capitalism had not yet caught up with industrial reality. They also misunderstood the nature of power itself. They believed that economic power could be separated from political power, that they could control the productive capacity of the nation while allowing formal democracy to continue operating in some separate sphere. This was always an illusion. When J.P. Morgan could personally prevent a financial collapse that the government could not address, when Rockefeller controlled 90% of a commodity essential to modern life, when Carnegie could deploy private armies against striking workers with the implicit backing of state governments, economic power and political power had already merged. The question was not whether America would be governed by concentrated power. The question was whether that power would be accountable to democratic processes or would operate as a private oligarchy. The violence that characterized labor relations during the Gilded Age was not an accident or an excess. It was the logical result of a system where one class controlled the means of production and another class had nothing to sell but their labor, and where there were no institutional mechanisms to mediate that fundamental conflict. When workers at Homestead tried to negotiate the terms of their employment, they were met with hired guns because the system provided no other way to resolve the dispute. When Pullman workers struck because they could not afford to eat after rent was deducted from their already reduced wages, federal troops were sent to break the strike because allowing workers to exercise collective power threatened the entire structure of industrial control. The brutality was not a failure of the system. It was the system working as designed, maintaining hierarchies through force, when economic pressure alone proved insufficient. The reformers of the progressive era understood what many of their contemporaries did not. The choice was not between keeping the Gilded Age system or destroying capitalism entirely. The choice was between reforming capitalism to make it compatible with democracy or watching it collapse into either oligarchy or revolution. Theodore Roosevelt's trust-busting was not anti-capitalist. It was an attempt to preserve capitalism by preventing any single entity from accumulating enough power to subvert market competition entirely. The regulatory agencies were not socialist institutions. They were emergency measures designed to impose the kind of limits that democratic societies require, but that market forces alone will not generate. Even the income tax, which seemed radical at the time, was simply an acknowledgement that democratic governments need the ability to address wealth concentration that threatens social stability. What made reform possible was the recognition among some members of the elite that their own long-term interests required accepting limits on their power. Roosevelt came from their class. Wilson understood their world. Even Franklin Roosevelt, for all his willingness to challenge concentrated wealth, was himself a product of that world and understood how it functioned. These men were not radicals imposing external constraints. They were insiders who recognized that the system was becoming unsustainable and that modest reform was preferable to violent upheaval. They were correct, but they were also too late. By the time serious reform efforts began, the contradictions had already built two levels that would eventually require not just regulation, but fundamental restructuring. The First World War accelerated processes that were already underway. It destroyed the European model that American elites had tried to emulate. It gave workers and women experience with economic power that changed their expectations permanently. It integrated the American economy into global systems in ways that made isolation impossible. But most fundamentally, it demonstrated that the existing order was not permanent, that social structures that had existed for centuries could be swept away in less than a decade, that concentrated power was vulnerable in ways that those who held it rarely acknowledged until it was too late. The Great Depression completed what the war had begun. It destroyed not just fortunes, but the entire social and cultural framework that had sustained Gilded Age inequality. The mansions were demolished, but more importantly, the assumptions that had made those mansions seem appropriate were abandoned. The idea that a few families should live in palaces while millions struggled to eat, the notion that wealth concentration was evidence of superior virtue, the belief that private power should operate without democratic accountability, all of these were discredited so thoroughly that they would not return in their original form. The New Deal represented a permanent shift in American political economy, an acknowledgement that unregulated capitalism produced outcomes that democracy could not tolerate. The speed of the collapse was the most instructive aspect. These families had built for permanence, had constructed structures from materials chosen to last centuries. They had established social rituals and institutions designed to perpetuate their status across generations. They had accumulated wealth on scales that seemed to make them invulnerable to any conceivable economic disruption. And within a single generation, almost all of it was gone. The palaces were demolished. The fortunes dissipated. The social structures collapsed. The assumptions that had sustained the entire system were abandoned. What they had believed was permanent lasted barely 50 years, and its end came with a speed and completeness that shocked everyone who witnessed it. The lesson is not complicated, though it is frequently ignored. Concentrated power, whether political or economic, is fundamentally incompatible with democratic governance over the long term. Systems that allow a small group to accumulate disproportionate control will eventually face either reform or revolution. And those who hold power rarely choose reform until it is too late to be effective. The Gilded Age elite had decades of warning. They had labor strikes that turned violent, progressive reformers who articulated alternatives, economic panics that revealed systemic instability. They dismissed all of it, believing that their power was too complete to be challenged, that their wealth was too vast to disappear, that the world they had built would endure because they willed it to endure. If you found this story worth your time, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this. Stories about power, about systems that seemed permanent until they weren't, about the distance between what people believed and what actually happened. If there are specific topics or periods you think deserve this kind of examination, leave them in the comments. History is not a collection of facts. It is a series of warnings, and some of them are worth hearing.